Because what you don't know about energy can kill you. Here's Alex Epstein.
Welcome to Power Hour. I'm Alex Epstein. President Biden has recently announced that he is using a certain what's called social cost of carbon, which is an idea that I think is a very bad idea, but is an idea that's not very well understood. So I wanted to bring on somebody who understands this well and has written about it so that we could talk about it. And so I could also share some of my ideas and get them vetted by a real economist on these issues. So I'm going to bring in David Kreutzer, who is senior economist at the Institute for Energy Research, a longtime economist. He's been on the show several years ago, but it's been a while, so it's good to have him back. David, welcome back to Power Hour.
Oh, thanks for having me back on. Really appreciate the work you do.
Oh, well, likewise. Okay, so let's jump right in with, tell us what exactly the Biden administration announced recently.
Yeah, well, the Biden administration announced that they want to reevaluate something called the social cost of carbon. That had originally been an Obama administration item. They brought in a bunch of people to come up with a number. It wasn't high enough, so they had them rework it. When Trump came in, we said, look, this thing has so many uncertainties. It can go from a huge negative number to a huge positive number, and it's just useless right now for use. And so he pretty much got rid of it. So they're bringing that back, and they said second day or whatever, first week in office, that he wants to have a working number within 30 days and then reevaluate it over the next year. And big surprise, it turns out there were a bunch of people that had numbers ready. And so they jumped in with new, somewhat higher numbers, and other people saying, well, we actually need to make the numbers gargantuan. So that's where we are. They want to use this number to guide, as they say, put that in quotation marks, regulation. And it would also be the benchmark for any carbon tax that they would propose.
Gotcha. Okay, let's start off with this name, social cost of carbon, because my thesis is that carbon-based energy is basically the best thing that's ever happened to the world. So one would think of it as, well, if you're going to talk about social, this is the greatest social benefit in human history. So one point you've made to me privately that I don't hear much is that even on the terms of the catastrophists, social cost of carbon isn't the right term. So how do you, what exactly is this, and how should it be described?
The economists for at least a century have been making a living looking for something called externalities, either external costs or external benefits. And what that is you look for some spillover effect. And you say, well, the market's not handling that. It's handling everything else, but it's not handling these spillover effects, some sort of pollution. And therefore, we need to modify the market. And usually what they come up with, if you're an economist, is either a tax or a subsidy that will take care of that little bit that the market's missing. Now, when we look at carbon, we look at fossil fuels. What they call, the economists call the private benefit, as you mentioned, they're huge. All right. They give us a standard of living that we couldn't possibly have without them. And so the economists are saying, okay, yeah, we get that, but it's off a teeny bit here. And so we're going to go look and see how much it's off and propose a tax to fix it. So it really should be the external cost of carbon, actually should be the external cost of carbon dioxide. And of course, they don't look too hard for external benefits. And we've seen plenty of those, especially in the form of greening. The world has simply gotten greener because of CO2, primarily as a fertilizer for plants. It makes photosynthesis so much more efficient to have higher levels of CO2. But also, the studies are pretty clear that the warmer world is a greener world.
Yeah. So the most obvious thing about this is on this externality kind of framework, which I want to challenge in a second, is that, okay, well, there's enormous, and it is really serious. Like, there's an enormous benefit to having more plant food in the atmosphere. And it's crazy that the world just doesn't, I think a lot of this goes down to philosophy. I think it's just the philosophy that it's wrong for us to impact things. Yeah. So we can't see that there's this massively positive impact. And also warming is very desirable throughout history. And I think most people would say the warming tends to occur more in the places where you'd want it, like toward the poles and at night and in winter. So my whole view is that it's an human impact morality that's driving this. And this relates to, I think, economics. Like, economics is not just its own independent thing apart from philosophy. Like, if you think about what's the goal, and I'll stop ranting in a second, but if you think about
go ahead.
What's the implicit philosophy of all this externality stuff, it's the philosophy called utilitarianism. And it's basically saying, well, the greatest good for the greatest number, and the conception of the market in this. So on a more individualistic framework, a market is just the interactions of free people who want to act voluntarily to mutual benefit. It's not something anyone has a right to say, oh, I think everyone should benefit more, so I get to control your life. Or I think Alex is a jerk, and if he got killed, that would make everybody happier. So therefore the Economist kings get to order Alex or Socrates put to death, right? So it's coming on this immoral framework of utilitarianism. I think that's part of it, but also if you look at even in part because the market is not, prices in the market are not utilitarian measures. And I really want to ask you about this, because there's this crazy idea that somehow, the private benefit based on these prices somehow measures benefit. But I'll just give an obvious example. Like if I buy, oil, and that oil is a helicopter that saved my life, and let's say I make $1 million across my lifetime, that helicopter was worth $500,000 to me. That oil, right, was worth
Yeah.
So would you agree that the market prices are not measures of utility? They're related to utility, as in we'll only pay as much as something is worth, but most of the time we get consumer surplus, which is far more.
Right. And even in the bland world of neoclassical economics, with those curves that we bored everybody with, we're teaching economics, they would point out that we're looking at the marginal, value, whether you want to call it marginal utility. And the famous case is water. What's the price of water? It's almost nothing. What's the total value of water? It's infinity. And so, but I think you go to something even beyond that it's not just this smooth thing with lines intersecting and curves being tangent and so on. The real world effects of energy, where do you put the marginal value on the ambulance that saves umpteen lives, like your helicopter? So they miss that. But they're trying to say, okay, even with this market, we're going to say, things are a little bit off. We're going to jigger it around. And one of the things part of what you said brought up, is that, we have markets for the private benefits. We don't usually, and not in this case, we don't have markets for the external benefits or the external costs. And that's where they come in using all this arbitrary measure to try to figure out what would it be, and bless them for trying, I guess. But we don't have a market for that's explicitly said so for warmth. But, I've tried to look into it. I mean, it's pretty clear people would rather be on average warmer than they are now.
Well, we do have a market for warmth. I mean, that's why people live in California.
Right. No, what I'm saying is I'm trying
the world.
Yeah, it's called the world. No, we excuse me. Yeah, we do have a market for it, but I can't find the price. And I'm really stunned that people haven't really looked at that. That would be an obvious thing to do research on. If you're talking about looking at the cost benefit analysis for CO2 and the warming, well, how much benefit does it give to all the people who on average would rather live in a slightly warmer place? And there's no number on that. I spent a couple of days last week trying to find it and was stunned. I would have thought that real estate markets or, some sort of, there are a couple of articles out there that get to it as a sort of a side case. But in any event, yes. So we don't see that, which is, in my mind, this illustrates one of the huge problems with even in theory looking at the social cost of carbon. And that is there's researcher bias. And if you start out thinking, okay, carbon dioxide is bad, you're going to start putting in your model estimates of all the bad things it does. You're not going to naturally look for all the good things. You may to force yourself to try to say, well, there's something good, I guess, let me see, and throw it in. But it's really easy to not find things you don't want to find. And so that's, to me, that's one of the biggest problems of the social cost of carbon exercise that we're going through, is we don't look for the benefits.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I want to come back to that in a minute, but I think the example of water is great. So when people are explaining like the marginal utility, they'll often use, at least the Austrians will use, like water and diamonds.
Right.
Why do diamonds cost more than water? But I think so there are reasons why on a market, certainly diamonds cost a lot more than water, but it has to do with the cost of, the main thing is the cost of producing it. It's like, we know how to produce water at very low cost, but it's important that the actual value of, like, the value of water to an individual is greater than the value of diamonds to an individual. Like, if they had to choose, they would choose water. So I just really want to rebel against this. I think that people have this idea that the market prices are reflecting utility, like absolute utility to the individual. Whereas in reality, no, they're reflecting the supply and demand is related to utility. But again, it's just limited by utility.
What we would say is, what would you do with one more gallon of water? Well, I'm already hosing off the sidewalk in the summer, and so the next gallon that I would have this year has very little, utility to me. And if you cut off 1 gallon, I probably wouldn't notice it. It's not. I mean, if you cut off the gallon I'm going to drink today, sure. What would I do with one more? Well, I don't like diamonds too much, but something like that. If you gave me one more, I don't know, something I do like that's valuable, gold coin. I don't know.
But okay, I just want to make one more philosophical point about this. Like, if you look globally, so if you're using sort of Alex's, again, I'm not a utilitarian, but if you are being utilitarian, which is the premise of all of this, the implication would be you should subsidize the hell out of water around the world. Because think about it, like, everyone's focused on CO2 and people don't have freaking clean water. And so, but what this shows is this whole, it's like a total fraud that this is actually based on optimal value. And it's ignoring what is actually valuable. And the fact that the prices we pay do not reflect the full value. And in general, the more basic the thing, the more of an actual value surplus there is. So like water, oil, like those are the things we would pay, like life-saving drugs. Like those are the things we would pay as much as we could. And things like diamonds and this other stuff would go by the wayside in terms of its absolute value to us.
No, let me, you talk about, we need to get clean water. And there are some people trying to push and drill wells where they don't have it, and bless them for doing that. But let's bring up how absurd it is, this focus and almost a monomaniacal obsession with carbon dioxide. The World Bank and other lending agencies, international, development agencies, have prohibited financing coal power plants. Now, in a lot of the developing world where they don't have natural gas and they don't have natural gas distribution systems, coal would be like the cheapest way for them to get electrified, to bring electricity into their house. So many of them don't have it in these very poor countries. They've ruled that out. All right. They said, no, we're not going to do that. They may put up some solar panels and so on, but one of this is the World Bank had it on the front page of their energy section. This was maybe 6 years ago. The Clean Cook Stove Initiative. I don't know if you're familiar with that. People went around, they said, well, in these very poor countries, people are cooking inside their house, they're using wood and coal and dung and whatever else, and it's smoky in the house, and that's not so good for their health. Instead of saying, well, let's build a coal-fired power plant and have them have electric hot plates so there's zero smoke inside their house, they came up with this development for a modern cook stove that burned half as much dung. And it was like, how absurd could you get? You could help these people so much more with a coal-fired power plant that you have banned. And instead, you're doing this feel good by not really helping them much with this cook stove. And in fact, some economists looked at the impact and they found that even those places that got the cook stoves had zero benefits from them. They quit using them after a couple of years. They went and they looked at what happened to health effects and so on. They had a really good model. There were some people that got the stoves and some people that wanted them but didn't get them. And they compared the two groups. Bingo, nothing different, no difference. So the Clean Cook Stove Initiative was not only a pathetic attempt, it was a no impact attempt whatsoever. Yet these groups will not allow modern coal-fired power plants, and a modern coal-fired power plant is so much cleaner than what we had 50 years ago. All those pictures of smoky Pittsburgh, you don't have smoky Pittsburgh anymore. Of course, they're not making so much steel, but we've cleaned it up. And it would be so much better for those countries to have coal-fired power with lights and electric stoves, than to have burning sticks and whatever.
So I think that's an illustration of, so my first kind of big point that I'm harping on is that you can call it the social benefit. I would really call it the human benefit of energy. is far, far, far greater than the price paid for energy. So you cannot treat the price paid for energy as the value of energy. And so this is a case like, how much is it worth to the lives of people to have cooking that actually works, that they can afford? You don't have to gather all this dung all day. You're not getting all these fumes. Like, that is an enormous value. And I think a key thing is, they don't have there's not an alternative for them that's cost effective. So what does it mean to say, like, this idea, oh, well, like, we'll pass a carbon tax and that'll somehow, no, if you anything you do to prevent them from using this is just an enormous disvalue to their life. Yet all these economist kings are just ignoring this reality. Because they don't understand their whole system, because of the bias and because they're equating like marginal utility with absolute utility. They're just denying this huge benefit that is then going to kill a bunch of people.
Right. Let me give you another anecdote, but at the risk of sort of anecdoting you to death.
No,
there's a case in India where there's this village that didn't have electricity, and they've been promised electricity. So how are they coming in? Well, hey, modern world, they're giving them solar panels. Now, of course, solar panels don't work so well at nighttime, and you can't turn them up and down and whatever else. And the village actually revolted and said, "We want real electricity." Yeah,
that was the Darnay. I think the Darnay example that Longwork talked. I learned about it from him. I don't know where you learned about it. Yeah, but I'm actually using that in my new book, because it is. And then they finally connected them to the coal grid. But the point I made, if it was up to these organizations, there wouldn't be a coal grid to connect to. And I consider that's like an almost infinite destruction. And the idea that economists are acting like preventing this as a benefit is just, to me, a total abdication of the purpose of the field.
Yes. No, I agree 100%. And economists are famous for working their little models and thinking they're going to be implemented the way they drew them up on the blackboard. So that, here we found a slight error. And, the numbers they're coming up with were like, $7, $8, $10, $15 a ton 10 years ago. That didn't really argue for doing too much, which is what we would expect, because the value of oil and coal and natural gas is so huge compared to this external cost that we should probably ignore it, given the fact that the government's not going to be able to implement, this small carbon tax. But it's been twisted. It's like, it's as though carbon-based fuels are like smoking cigarettes. The less is always better. That they're inherently evil, and so anything you do to reduce fuel use is good, which is, as you pointed out, is just absurd. And the economists in their ivory tower are not saying that, but that's how it gets translated once it gets put into DC.
Yeah. So I want to talk about that again in a minute. But one more thing. So there's sort of my big criticism. One is just they're not recognizing the human benefit of fossil fuels that isn't captured in the price. But the other thing is that if you want to talk about positive externalities, so you mentioned there's the CO2 externality, but from my reading, at least, of externalities, people will often talk about something like research and development as having a lot of positive externalities. Like, you engage in this, people engage in research and development, and people benefit from that all over the place in a way that the research and development people aren't paid. Well, think of something like the coal and like how the coal industry and the oil industry and the gas industry, by freeing up huge amounts of human time, made possible modern research and development. And if you look forward, how much every minute of time you free up, that makes possible more innovation. I don't see people talking about those kinds of benefits. What do you? And that's to me, that's a huge positive externality that isn't discussed.
Yeah, no, I guess I agree 100% with these benefits. We can get tripped up whether they're external or private, and but there's a huge amount of research that goes on in energy development. I mean, the smart drilling with the horizontal drilling and the fracking and all of that. There's a lot of research, and undoubtedly there's spillovers from that. This notion that we should just pour piles of money into researching something that's in itself not useful, that we were going to get spillovers from all this research that will justify it, which we hear a lot. You say, well, why are we putting all this money into this particular technology? Doesn't it? Well, but we get these spillover effects. We got Tang from this going to the moon. So we should primarily focus on doing research where we expect the benefit to be at least worth the cost. That's good. And we do see, but I think you're right. Your basic point that in addition to, making locomotives move and to heating our house, the energy use and it's, the fact that we have it everywhere allows us to do things way beyond what we thought. I mean, just what we're doing today, was something we wouldn't have thought about 10 years ago, certainly not 50 years ago. And so nobody in putting up the electric grid said, well, we're going to have people be able to use video conferencing if we build this electric grid. But without it, we wouldn't have the video.
Yeah, that's the final, and I'll stop pushing on this point, but it has been a passion of mine for 10 years because I hate how this issue is misrepresented by economists. But you take the internet, right? So I look back in the 70s and we have my anti-heroes like Paul Ehrlich and Amory Lovins all say, we use way too much electricity.
Yeah.
What, you need another electric toothbrush? Come on, electricity is we don't need electricity. And you think about without fossil, and they were talking about getting rid of fossil fuels back then in significant quantities. You think about without the fossil fuel industry, particularly the coal industry, if you think about electricity, there would be no modern internet. Now, when economists talk about private benefits, how the hell can you say, oh, somehow the value of the internet was paid for in the cost that the coal people made? It was not paid to them.
Right.
And that's one or both of us could, the internet could have extended one or of our lives even. One of us could be dead maybe without something that the internet made possible. So it's just this idea that, oh, the price reflects all the benefits. And then we get to come and and then we get to say, oh, there's something negative that wasn't in the price. So then we're going to stop you from using this thing that saved your life. This just seems completely corrupt to me.
It saves a little bit too much of your life. We need to save just 98% of your life, not the whole thing. Yeah, I agree with you that they get so caught up in the cleverness of their ideas and actually, even though they're complicated computer models, it's much simpler than reality, and they miss all these sorts of things, right?
So let's talk then about what is going into these social cost or external, what actually goes into these calculations?
Yeah, and even though it's wrong, we can call it the social cost of carbon. That's what everybody else calls it. Well, so first of all, you have to have the climate models predicting what's going to happen to temperature, 80 years from now, 100 years from now, and even 300 years from now, believe it or not. And some of them go 1,000 years or more down the road. I mean, that's how absurd it is, and so you need to be able to say, okay, first of all, how much CO2 are we going to be putting into the atmosphere? All right. That's actually not an easy question to answer, as you probably understand. There's something called representative concentration pathway, RCP, that the IPCC models use. And the most exaggerated of them all is 8.5. And of course, that's the one they all use. That's the one that they're using for Biden's new social cost of carbon. And it assumes that everybody that's now using gas switches back to coal and uses ever more amounts of coal, and on and on and on. So it's the most unrealistic set of assumptions possible. So you plug that in, and then you have to say, well, how sensitive is the average global temperature, however you want to measure that, to increases in CO2 concentrations? That's not settled. And in fact, most of the estimates done for most of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change models were done from models themselves. And people have looked at empirical estimates of it, have come up with much lower numbers. So instead of saying doubling CO2 leads to a 3, 4, 5, 10 degree increase in temperature, it looks like it's going to be, maybe 1 to 1.5 degrees centigrade for a doubling, which is sort of where we're headed by the end of this century. That's not a huge deal. All right. We've seen way more warming than that in the past. So you take that, so they're going to get much higher numbers than reality, too high a number for the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere over the next couple of centuries, too high a sensitivity of the world temperature to the CO2. And then you have to look at, well, how much will that higher temperature affect sea level? How much will higher sea level affect erosion and storms and blah, 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 blah? How much will the higher temperature affect agricultural productivity, which they get pretty much wrong? because they look at short-term temperature changes, predicting longer term when you would have time to adapt, and all sorts of things. So it's not simple, and they come up with these numbers that I think are probably more likely to be exaggerated than underestimated. But let's let them have that. The big kicker is, and we could talk for the rest of the hour.
I want to talk about discount rate in a minute.
Okay, good.
Which I assume is what you're getting to.
Yeah.
So let me just give my own view of these three. So I think the most plausible one that you could honestly try to predict is concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere under different scenarios. Not that it's easy or not that you can do with accuracy, but if you take like specific knowledge of what's going to happen to and I want to stress specific, of what's going to happen in the global climate system that can tell you anything about anywhere specific on the globe. We have basically no knowledge of that. So, because it's important. Like, I don't think there's there's no confidence in real confidence in being able to predict global average temperatures. That's why if you look at the IPCC, their sensitivity estimate from a doubling of CO2 ranges from 1.5 to 4.5, which basically means we have no idea what the hell is going to happen. So, and they don't admit that, but even if you knew one of those, you don't know what's going to happen in a specific, like what's going to happen in Chicago and what's going to happen in here and what's going to happen in there. And then like the knowledge of what that's going to do to different storm patterns. Like, are you going to get more? I would just say that, so I want to just make clear, there are a lot of things we don't know. But it's dishonest to act like we know them. And even you could say like, we're confident they're going to get worse, which I would question. But so it's just, this thing is basically, there's very little ability to predict warming impact and then other climate impacts. And then the adaptation one, or what I would call the mastery, I think that's more predictable, but only in the general sense that it's very hard to imagine something we can't adapt to. And that's what history is showing us. I mean, we have a wealthy, machine labor, as I call it, machine labor civilization. Climate-related deaths are down 98% over the past century. Like, I've been trying for my new book to think about scenarios that would actually be a problem for human beings. And like beyond multi-foot a decade sea level rises, it's very hard to think of anything that would actually be a problem over a timescale of 80 or 100 years. So my sense of it is and I just want to link this to one thing. You mentioned that people are going into this not like just out of idle curiosity, but with a bias. And a lot of this is to justify climate policy, restricting fossil fuels. So of course, the bias is going to be overestimate the climate impacts, underestimate our adaptive abilities. And then that's where you get, and then you're going to get your magical number. Would you?
I agree with that 100%. And it's almost comical. There was a study that came out, when I first came up here, maybe 2009, 10, called The Cost of Doing Nothing. And that got huge press. It was saying, if we don't do anything, about climate, here's going to be the cost on the economy. And, you looked at real estate damage on the coast. Literally, they assumed nobody would adapt, that the sea level would rise. And they had a big sea level rise. I can't remember, it was 10 feet or something like that. And it was like people would go out at low tide to pour the foundations of their buildings. It was almost that stupid. So they would look at that and they say, here's the damage that was done. And of course, it's the damage that's done to an economy that's so much richer because we've used all this energy. And the analogy I make is like saying, well, I spend $300 commuting to work each month. If I quit working, I'll have $300 more a month to spend. You can't say we're going to have this damage done to the economy by the thing that actually makes the economy go, and somehow think you can get rid of it. Now, you can talk about moderating it, but they didn't. They didn't look at, say, well, here's how much of that damage we could save with this policy that costs this much. They simply said, here's how much damage is going to be. And the implication was we should do at least that much to stop it, or even more. It was absurd. But so you're right. You get caught up in this, these games that they play of looking at what the costs are going to be. They don't know them, and they don't look at adaptation. Excuse me. I say Richard Tall clearly does, and some of them may, but I think they've underestimated our creative ability.
So one more aspect before we get to discount rate, which I know is the thing you really love to hammer, is part of any of these estimates is, what is your view of the state of alternatives? right? I mean, what,
Yes.
because you're mentioning that the economy is based on fossil fuels, which it is. What if there are no real substitutes? And I would say there are certainly no substitutes when you've criminalized nuclear for the indefinite future.
Yeah.
So, like, we don't have a way of eliminating CO2 and having substantial amounts of energy. It just doesn't exist in the world given today's situation.
Yes.
So, how do they, when they're talking about like, oh, here's a severe here's like I mean, some of them will show like, oh yeah, this carbon tax, like Nordhaus will show this carbon tax would be too much, but how are they modeling alternatives? Because my sense is they're dramatically overestimating the cost effectiveness of alternatives, particularly given that the Greens are in charge of energy and that they'll restrict everything, including the green alternatives.
Yeah, most of the economists are thinking marginal, a little bit less here and a little bit less there, and maybe a little bit more solar here, I guess. Nordhaus, if you look at his projections out to 2100, which he doesn't do anymore, he did it in a paper back in 2013. The lines are over top of each other. His optimal, GDP path, if you use the exact right set of carbon taxes, versus the not doing anything at all versus doing too much. Doing nothing at all was within like 4% of being 6 times richer in 80 years. So this notion that we need to get rid of everything, I don't think you would get that. Well, I don't know. He's kind of kowtowing to them. But in any event, you're right. They're assuming that we will come up with ways to integrate 80, 90% solar into our energy grid, and that we will come up with cost-effective storage to do that. I mean, that's the only way you can read this. Could it happen? Hey, we're really creative. Do you want to bet everything on that particular solution being the best one? No, absolutely not. So that's, to me, that's a huge problem. That's a problem with this, similar electric car mandate. The California, everybody's going to mandate these electric cars. Electric cars may end up being the thing. But if you're going to mandate them, you have to be 100% sure that they're going to be the thing, that you're going to be able to get the lithium, you're going to be able to get the cobalt, you're going to be able to beef up the electric grid to absorb all this new demand. And they're not. It's a similar sort of notion that, well, we will assume if we put pressure here, people are creative there, for some reason they're not creative like you and I think they are to adapt to climate change, but they're going to be infinitely creative in coming up with new energy sources.
Yeah, that's such an interesting. I mean, that could be a whole subject. Just how this assumption of like omnipotent creativity applies to making the arbitrary wishes of the eco-dictators happen.
Yeah,
but it cannot handle changes in climate conditions over 100 years.
Yes. Yeah, from sort of right at the advent of agriculture, 5,000 years ago, we were coming out of the last ice age. And look, there were multiple centuries where sea level rose by more than 5 feet. But these are people that had like zero technology to adapt to anything. I mean, I'm sure there was already pressure on who got the choicest hunting ground and so on. Now, 5 feet of sea level rise is going to be very costly in terms of, the stuff we have along the coast and whatnot. But it's not existential, and again, we're talking about, people 80 years from now that are going to be probably, at least in the US, 4 times richer. 150 years from now, who knows, 10 whatever times richer.
Well, if we don't restrict fossil fuels, I mean, they're basically telling us to adopt Venezuela's. I mean, is Venezuela richer than it was 20 years ago? No, it is. So there's this assumption of all. So it's interesting to look into these things, but I just think that assumption about the actual viability of the alternatives that are allowed to function and how they're allowed to function and how they're implemented, namely by government dictate.
Right.
Like, we're just getting mild previews with California and with Texas. Like, are any of these people modeling, hey, what happens when you're so when you've defunded your reliables, you defund resiliency, you have extremely low base load to accommodate as much wind as possible.
Right.
You need to quadruple your amount of, your supply. Wind goes out to lunch, solar. Like, what happens if by giving ourselves less control of electricity, we screw up and then we have this blackout? Like, oh, and it costs 50 billion. Like, is anyone factoring this in? I don't.
Yeah, I don't think they are
at all.
I don't think they are either. And that's a great point. And it's, I think there's this assumption, and a wrong one in my mind, that if it isn't working out, then we'll fix it. We'll go back a little bit to the fossil fuels. I don't have that confidence whatsoever. We see so often when a policy is failing, they blame something else and double down on the failed policy. Back when I was writing my dissertation back in the 70s on OPEC and energy and so on, I went and looked. I went back and looked. I lived through that, but I'm looking back like a decade. And what did people blame? We had waiting lines for gasoline. You've probably heard the stories. There were actual shortages because we had price controls in effect. Price controls only on petroleum in the U.S., not worldwide. It was totally bizarre. And because we had these ceilings and the demand, because of inflation and so on, was going, and growing economy was going up, we had people wanting to buy more gasoline than the suppliers were willing to supply in the U.S. at a given time. Is classic case of shortages due to price controls. Every economist can tell you what's going to happen. The surveys, Gallup, I went back and looked at Gallup surveys. People didn't blame OPEC for the problem. They didn't blame price controls. They blamed the oil companies, and to fix it, and there was a slight majority that wanted to actually issue ration coupons for gasoline. So in my mind, that was a crystal clear case of what economists could see was the problem, and the people, saw something else as the problem. And you see that in Venezuela. What's the problem? It's this horrible socialist dictatorship. And what do they say the problem is? It's America's boycott. And so we need to double down, and it just gets worse and worse. And that's a concern to me, that you're right. We have this grid stability, grid reliability that is critical. I mean, clearly people die from it when the electricity stops, people that need to have their oxygen pump running, all these sorts of things, or just get cold. This heartbreaking story of a kid that froze to death. So we're getting away from that. And if it's not, if their, magic storage technologies don't work, and we have these regular blackouts, rich people are going to be able to buy backup generators, all right, assuming that you can get the fuel for them. But most people are not going to be doing that. And I'm not sure that we will rectify it. So I'm really worried. It's not a kind of what we would call in economics a stable equilibrium. You can get away from it and it can collapse, and anything. I can go on and on. I can tell.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. But I would just want to stress in the models they're not accounting for this. So I just want to reiterate. So I think these models are all these calculations are terrible because they assume they understand what's going to happen with climate in a relevant way. And they're always biased. They have every incentive to exaggerate it. They clearly underestimate adaptation / mastery, and they clearly overestimate the abilities of alternatives in reality to substitute at the levels. So we have all this. And so what they'll give us, and then we're going to talk about discount rate, is like they'll say, per ton of CO2. So they'll say something like, I think Biden is saying $51. But really, a lot of the more extreme people don't want $51 because that's something like 50 cents a gallon.
Right.
They want they'll say oh, it's $500 or $5,000. But let's say it's $51. There's still this issue of what the discount rate. So what is it worth to prevent X damage in the future? So explain.
Well, that $51 reflects, supposedly, okay, let me just to run it through again so people can see how unsure this stuff is. We're saying for every ton of CO2 emitted today, it will make the world a little warmer today, a little bit more warm the year after that, and subsequent warming every year for maybe hundreds of years, some say thousands, but probably hundreds. And that additional warming is going to make sea level a little bit higher in 2021, a little bit higher yet in 2022, and so on up to 2100 and 2200 and 2300. So we're looking at all of these impacts of your CO2 ton that you emitted today for 3 centuries down the road, every single year, 3 centuries down the road. What is the damage that additional warming from the CO2 is going to do through sea level rise and whatever storms, though we're of course not observing any more storms from higher temperature here. But they make these estimates. So that's what they're doing. And they're saying, okay, when we have this big storm in 2100 or 2200, it's going to do this much damage to a much wealthier country. It'll be easier to do more damage because it's wealthier, unless they've adapted better. Well, how much is that? How much should we pay to stop that damage in 300 years? And so that's where the discounting comes in. So they get the
Are they actually using 300 years?
So, yeah, 2300 was how far out they went for. Excuse me. Okay, so that's 300 years. They're going to 2300 for the interagency working group back in 2010. They ran the integrated assessment models out to 2300 in order to find out what the damage were. I'm not joking.
Okay.
So, you know,
okay, go on. I mean, I just find that absurd that you have laws today that are like, oh, what's going to happen in I mean, imagine somebody had done that today, like 300 years ago for today.
Well,
didn't know anything about what's going to happen.
No, I agree 100%. The Stern review, which wasn't one of the ones, but one of the modelers for the Stern review was on the interagency working group's set of models. That was a famous, thing that came out talking about how much damage climate is going to be. They actually went out. Somebody pointed out that half of the damages that they're talking about incurring now and forever didn't actually occur until after the year 2800. So it's, I mean, and they think they're being more clever or more serious by doing that. Okay, so we have this number. Let's say it's I just did some calculations looking back to the Civil War, but let's say we go out about 160 years, $100 worth of damage. How much should we pay today to fix that $100 worth of damage? How much should we pay to cut CO2 because we think it's going to do that much damage in 160 years?
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you do it at 1%, you get something like $50.
Do what? 1%?
I'm sorry. Thank you. All right. The discount rate. So you use use the net present value. It's a calculation, and it came up because businesses understand. For instance, if I'm going to invest $1 today and I'm going to get $10, 50 years from now, is that a good deal? Well, it depends. What other alternative investments could you make? And so you look at the interest rate that reflects those alternative investments, and you can say, okay, that I will discount at that alternative interest rate, which, by the way, the stock market in the U.S. for the past 200 years has averaged pre-tax over 7%, real return adjusted for inflation over 7%. All right. And it's been fairly constant, if you take a long enough time period. It's not like it all zoomed in at the end or all at the beginning. So if you take that 7% discount rate, it says something pretty reasonable. 150-year benefit now, we probably shouldn't do too much. All right, they're going to be fabulously wealthy. And if we invested at 7%, if we invested $20 at 7% for 160 years, you get $900,000. All right. So we don't want to do something that's going to get them a $100 benefit 150 years from now. Okay. So if you discount at 1%, you get like $20. So it says, okay, I know there's these numbers that it's easy. I mean, it's not easy. I had to sit there and write them down. So I apologize to the people listening. If you use a discount rate of 1%, $100 damage 160 years from now says, okay, we should spend up to $20 to avert that damage 160 years from now. All right, if we're using a 1% discount rate. All right. But if you took that $20 again and you invested it at 7%, that's where you get that $900,000. So which one really says you care more for the future? You're making an investment that gets them $100, or you're making one that gets them $900,000. The climate benefit is the $100 benefit. Investing anywhere else in the stock market, cutting tax rates on investment, whatever, that says if you did that for 160 years, you would have way, way more. And it's just mind-boggling that the people doing this research say if you use a lower discount rate and justify a $20 expenditure that gets you $100 in 160 years, that means you care more about them than if you spent $20 and gave them $900,000. I mean, it's just absurd. So that's the discounting is really kind of messy, but it's important.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of a better term, a more accessible term than discount rate, because it seems like from another perspective, they're totally underestimating the opportunity cost of the money.
No, that's no. Okay, maybe that's a better way of saying it. They're underestimating the opportunity cost of what we could do today to help them in 160 years. All right.
So it's basically saying, like, I'm going to give 20, or whatever the statistic was, but it's like, I'm going to give $20 to, to prevent this thing in the future. Like, I'm investing $20 to get this $100 benefit versus getting $900,000.
That's exactly what they're saying. They're saying, this climate is so critical, and this is where it takes on almost religious overtones. It's like, okay, $100 worth of climate benefit is $100 worth of benefit. It comes in different ways. And if you're saying, well, you're underestimating it, well, then give me the number you think it should be. That saying that we're going to discount it, we're going to bring it back to the present using 1% rate of return, which is what they're saying, when we know we're likely to get 7% or more, is absurd.
So is it accurate to say they're ignoring or denying the opportunity cost of
yeah. They frequently, and they say, well, that's not what they say. We're doing something different. We're trying to come up with how much we should weigh the future's benefit to our benefit, which is absurd. That's not what they're doing. And if it is, they're doing it upside down. If we want to help the future, we want to make investments today that give them the biggest rate of return. Not some arbitrary. It's
like saying, I want to help the future by prohibiting every good investment.
Well, yeah,
you can only you can only store it under your mattress.
Okay, what if your an investment advisor came to you and said, well, you love your grandchildren tremendously? I do, yes. Okay, so we're going to go the way the IPCC thinks is the more you love the future, the lower the rate of return you should get. So if you really love them, I have this investment portfolio that's going to have a 0% rate of return to show how much you love your grandchildren. You would kick that person out of your house. You wouldn't listen to them again. But that's exactly what these social cost of carbonistas are saying when they're saying we need to use a lower discount rate if you love the future more, if you value them more. But it's totally backwards. If we're in a world where we have alternative investments that are going to give us, more than that 1%, and probably going to give us, going by historical trends, it's been around 7%, again, before tax, which is what we want in this case. We don't want to get them a crummy return. We want to get them a good return. And to say, well, that you're undervaluing their benefit. No, you've picked one specific case of an investment today and a benefit in the future. You're ignoring all these other ones. And that's what the discounting is supposed to do. It's supposed to say, no, this is relative to what else we could invest in. Your climate benefit that you want is terrible.
So maybe it's like, gosh, I had a way of putting it that I liked for a second, but it's something like, preventing these climate impacts is a terrible investment for your future, and it's going to harm your future by precluding far better investments.
Right. If we do this, and it's, right. It's sort of like we're going to give you the clean cook stove instead of the electric grid and an electric frying pan. The only way their story makes sense, and none of them have thought this through. Well, a couple have. Nordhaus has. Is if you're saying, well, okay, if we really love the future, we're going to, and we think that what's fair is a 1% discount rate, then we have to increase our savings rate so that we invest so much that the marginal return on investment goes down to 1%. And if you look at how much saving we would have to do for that, it's huge. And we've certainly, most of our tax system discourages saving, in so many ways. If you go, one way I like to look at it is go back 160 years, which is what I'm writing this paper on. The average production worker, adjusted for inflation, his hourly wage was about $2.60. Okay, $2.40, excuse me. A modern production worker, and I don't know if that's the wage, that's the cost per hour, including benefits, is 32. All right. So there's this huge difference in how much the people today make compared to what they made 160 years ago. We all understand that. So what we're saying is, for intergenerational equity, we want people making $2.40 to cut down on their consumption, do a lot more investment, make all this stuff so that those of us making, 20 times that, can have a better life. I mean, I don't, thank them for doing it. I think my great-great-grandfather sacrificed plenty for me. I don't want them to do more. I had ancestors dying from things that we could cure with a simple antibiotic tablet today. All this sort of stuff. Didn't have running water, didn't have electricity. Why do we want them to sacrifice? The people making these social costs of carbon 1% discount, they can't imagine that the world 150 years from now would be so much better off that they can handle whatever this carbon stuff is going to do.
The other thing is that, I made the point before about freeing up time. That is this benefit that people don't value. Like, the thing that benefits us from the past is all the time the wealth somewhat, but really the time for innovation. It's like, that's the knowledge of how to, cost effectively produce different kinds of values. That's what we care about. So let me ask one final question. I really appreciate you going back and forth with me, because I want to kind of talk about this with an economist, and I have.
I hope I've helped.
No, you've helped me a lot. So one more thing is, just what do you see the consequences of this going forward? And we'll try to lump together two things. So one is the Biden administration, but then also there is, in my view, an ominous trend of some of the energy groups, including API, American Petroleum Institute. It looks like they're starting to support a carbon tax based on this fallacious social cost of carbon. What do you see as the trajectory, the negative trajectory of this?
Yeah, I don't read minds. I have trouble figuring out what API is going to do. The American Petroleum Institute, who represent most of the oil and natural gas producers in the U.S. They may be panicking over electric car mandates, figuring, well, we'll be better off with a carbon tax than electric car mandate, but they're going to get both if they push it. There was also, when we looked at models, when I worked at the Heritage Foundation, we did estimates using the Department of Energy's modeling system. And this was, 6-7 years ago. And what happened when you put in a carbon tax initially was that the oil companies actually came out a little bit better. One, almost all of the carbon tax on gasoline and transportation fuels got shifted to the consumer because the demand is what we call so inelastic. On the other hand, coal got slaughtered. And so the carbon tax killed coal, which was replaced by natural gas, which a lot of these integrated producers have gas as well as oil. So I think, 7 years ago, a carbon tax was actually profitable for these oil companies. So much of the coal fleet has been decimated already. I don't know if there's that gain yet to be had. But they may be. There's this saying in DC, if you're not at the table, you're what's for dinner. And so they want to go there and they want to say, okay, they can come up with some carbon tax that maybe won't hurt them as much as some other regulations that they want to be a substitute. And by the way, I forgot to mention this. The economists assume with the social cost of carbon and using a carbon tax that matches that we get rid of all the other regulations.
It's so dishonest that they don't make. And Orrin Cass had this great piece several years ago called The Carbon Tax Shell Game. I don't know if you've ever read that, but I thought that was.
I may have.
He deals with like every one of the rationalizations, but one point he makes is there's this theoretical world that the economists are in where they say, oh yeah, well, this is going to replace all these inefficient regulations, but in the real world, it's a supplement to them. Is Biden going to repeal everything that doesn't meet the social cost of carbon? Like Keystone XL, that doesn't meet the social cost of carbon. Like none of his policies do. Electric cars, they're like the least efficient. So it's this combination of, but the economists still, and even the Republican groups cast shows, they support it. So they'll be like, oh yeah, we demand this standard, but in practice, nobody practices that standard, but they still support the carbon tax on top of the regulatory apparatus.
No, Schumer came out with the first time they said, oh yeah, no, this carbon tax is great. Of course, we'll still need the regulations just to make sure, we get what we want. The economist who came up with these offsetting excise taxes and subsidies was a guy named Pagoo. And so they call these Pagoovian taxes. So the carbon tax would be a Pagoovian tax. The line I like to use is that the carbon tax in DC has little to do with Pagoo and a lot to do with pig out. So these people see this as a revenue source, and that's primarily, and you've told them, look, we have this revenue source that is actually virtuous. well, they're not going to stop at whatever some economist comes up with, because they'll find an economist to tell them a higher number so they can get even more money. So where it goes, if I'm looking in a crystal ball, I'm a little bit scared. Some of my colleagues say, well, no, it's so unpopular, they'll never vote it. But they've been pushing. I still think it will be a tough vote right now to say we want to raise your gasoline price 50 cents or $1 a gallon. If it's going to be a $50 carbon tax, it's roughly 9 cents or 10 cents for each $10 of a carbon tax on the price of gasoline. That's a rule of thumb that works pretty well. And the same thing for heating oil, electricity. So the same percentage, increases. Do you want to, we saw what happened in Texas. Let's do a little bit of that. Is that what you're going to be happy with? They're going to make grandma just a little bit colder. You're going to make it a little harder to drive. All these sorts of things. I think in the past have proved unpopular. And another concern is that Biden simply declares a climate emergency. They've been plowing that field for a long time, trying to get people to think it's an existential threat. It's not. 1.5 degrees was set in stone somewhere. That's just pulled totally out of the air, that carbon limit. The temperature cap. So I wouldn't surprise me if he declares a climate emergency and imposes a carbon tax. Nobody on the Hill wants to vote for it. They all want to get the money from it. So that's the one that scares me the most. Invocation of, executive power to come up with a revenue scheme that, according to the Constitution, is supposed to originate in the House.
All right. Well, it is a very timely threat to discuss. I'm really grateful to you for coming on. Before we wrap up, tell listeners where they can learn more about your work.
Yeah, I'm at the Institute for Energy Research. So if you Google Institute for Energy Research, it'll take you. I think it's instituteforenergyresearch.org. We have our blog there, and we'd be happy to have it. It's a great group. It's a small group. I like to say we punch above our weight, and go ahead and find us. We learn what we can.
Awesome. Oh, and you're on Twitter, right?
Yes, DW Kreutzer.
How do you spell Kreutzer?
Kreutzer is Kreutzer.
All right, David, thanks so much for coming on.
Hey, thanks a lot for having me.
Thanks again to David Kreutzer for joining me. That was a really fun and cathartic conversation for me. I've been having a lot of these ideas about externalities and other things for years, and I'm still developing them, but I am quite confident that this whole externalities way of looking at things by modern economists is not only morally, but economically very problematic. And then certainly its application to the issue of CO2 is terrible. I would like at some point to, and I like this ability to just talk to economists. I would like to talk at some point to an economist like Richard Toll, somebody who's in this world. And I know he supports a carbon tax, but seems like a reasonable guy, definitely a very smart guy. And talk to them, or even I hope that economists listening to this, anyone who agrees with me or disagrees with me, tell me, because I want to keep pushing on this, but it's this issue where there is a lot of methodological stuff going wrong. And so it's a really good start today to talk to David and to get his take on it and to run my ideas by him, and also just to learn all the things that he knows about this. So appreciate that a lot. All right, big piece of news. It is Wednesday that I'm recording this, so Wednesday, March 3rd, and I am 100% on track to send my manuscript to the publisher on Thursday, March 4th, which is tomorrow. I'm just going to make a couple references and stuff like that, but I'm going to send them, a whole new book, and it'll take probably a month or 2 or 3 to edit and stuff, and so I'll still be making a lot of improvements. But in terms of getting the core thing together, which has taken me almost 2.5 years, that job is done. So it's very exciting to have that. I'm really grateful to everybody for their support, and I'm particularly grateful to the accelerators, those are the ones who support financially our research and development and our promotional efforts. It's allowed me to spend quite a lot of money on research and development and have some amazing research, amazing thinkers help me with this. And there's just no way it would be anywhere as near as good as it is and will be without this support. So thanks so much to accelerators. And then going forward, we're going to be able to make a lot of use of continuing accelerator contributions to promote the hell out of this thing. We're going to have another back when Moral Case came out, we did a books for teachers and students thing. I'm going to replicate that as well, where students and teachers in high schools and colleges can write in. And if they give us a reason why they really would like a free copy, then we can send one to them. We did a couple thousand of those. I hope we can do 10,000 plus, even 20,000 plus for the launch of the new book. So I'm not going to do that now, but we'll start rolling that out maybe in 6 months or 7 months as we get close to the publication date, which will either be late this year or very early next year. So there's that, but also now that I'm going to have some more time freed up, there's a lot more, I think, opportunity to do things like use online advertising to promote more of my ideas and also just to engage more publicly. So appreciate the accelerators. If you want to accelerate or accelerate again, you can go to industrialprogress.com/accelerate. All right, let's see what else. Make sure you're on my mailing list, alexepsteinlist.com. Make sure you're following what I'm doing on Twitter. I'm posting a lot of talking points there, twitter.com/alexepstein. And then, of course, I am updating energytalkingpoints.com. And as of now, I have a whole bunch of things to put up there, which should be up there in the next week or two. So look out for that. Let me just see, is there anything else that I'm missing? I think we are good for this week. So as I enjoyed this episode, hope you enjoyed it as well. Feel free to send in suggestions. And as I like to say, as always, you can write me with questions, comments, love mail, or hate mail to alex@alexepstein.com. All right, that is it for this week. Next week, I'll be back again, considering a few different guests. One of these times soon, I'm going to bring on Stefan Henna, my amazing researcher who's been doing particularly amazing work lately. We may do a segment. We may do a show on Bill Gates' book. I haven't read it yet since I've been finishing my own book, but I look forward to reading that soon. Curious if any of you have insights on that book. Feel free to email me with those insights. And I think that's an important book. I won't fully prejudge it, but based on what he's been saying publicly, it looks like it's going to be a disappointment relative to him saying fairly rational things. Like in the past, he's talked a bunch about what I would call the unreliables and the shortcomings of those. He's always been pretty bad about just parroting climate disaster type thing. So that certainly doesn't seem to be improving. But he is good in terms of talking about energy as one of the most important things. It's going to be really interesting to see how it shapes up. I think that's going to be, again, an important thing to talk about. All right, that's it for this week. I'll be back next week. Until then, I'm Alex Epstein. This has been Power Hour.
Power Hour. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of energy. Power Hour. The antidote to shallow thinking about energy issues.